I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely, stimulating topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode, our guest is Mideast and Syria expert, author, and international relations commentator and scholar Stephen Zunes, with degrees from Oberlin, Temple, and Cornell. He presently is professor of politics and international relations at the University of San Francisco, where he has served as chair of the Mideast Studies program. He also has distinguished himself for years in work on behalf of nonviolence and conflict resolution. And I welcome Stephen Zunes to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Well, let's begin by just saying that after 14 years of civil war and estimates of as high as maybe even over 600,000 dead, the Assad regime was overturned after a couple weeks. And Assad has found refuge in what had been a Syrian ally of Russia. Stephen, this was in some ways really more a political victory than a military one, wasn't it?
Oh, very much so. It was a political collapse. There were very few actual battles in those dramatic final couple of weeks. The regime, which had relied on Russian air support, which was now focused on Ukraine, and Hezbollah ground support, which had actually obviously been distracted by the devastating Israeli assault in recent months. You had to be dependent on conscripts and the Syrian army that were quite unwilling, it appears, to fight and die on his behalf. And so in many ways, it's reminiscent of the final days of the U.S.-backed Afghan government, and, or for that matter, the South Vietnamese government in 1975, where what appeared to be a stalemated situation ended up being a rout by the armed opposition.
Well, you mentioned the Afghanistan debacle, and I use the debacle advisedly, and I think somewhat wisely, because all of those weapons were left, and now we've got all these weapons in Syria. We've got all this poison gas, and what's going to happen with all that? What do you speculate?
Well, the weapon stores were always an issue of concern, given how the front lines were constantly shipping, how there were scores, even hundreds of different armed groups at one time or another. The new Syrian regime has been doing its best to try to secure these stocks. Of course, the Israeli government has ended up engaging in a massive bombing campaign that has targeted weapons depots and manufacturing, as well as airports, ports, and many other aspects of the Syrian infrastructure. So this is definitely a concern, but so far it appears that the new government, for what it is, has been consolidating its control over most of the territory, including areas where the major weapon stores may be.
The new government is really under the leadership of someone who was identified with al-Qaeda, who has a terrorist, essentially big money penalty on his head if he's brought to justice, so to speak, and who was also identified with the Taliban. Now there's talk about him wanting a constitution, wanting democracy, wanting pluralism, and being pragmatic. How much are we really to rely on that kind of metamorphosis or depend upon it? Trust it?
Yeah, I don't think we can rely on it. But so far, the signs are surprisingly good in terms of reiterating a commitment to the rights of religious minorities, and not demanding that women cover up. We haven't seen large-scale lynchings or other revenge towards regime supporters. If you look at the area up in the Idlib province, where the Tahrir al-Sham, the leading rebel group, has controlled for a number of years, it was definitely quite conservative. It was definitely authoritarian. There were political prisoners.
So living under Sharia too?
And to a limited extent. I mean, women weren't required to veil, and religious minorities were able to practice openly. But there were certainly some restrictions, but frankly not worse than some Arab regimes the U.S. is friendly with, especially in the Gulf region. So that may be a sign that I think hope for democracy might be a little naive. I don't think we have to worry about a Taliban type situation, nor do we have to worry about being a launching pad for terrorism, because all indications are their priority right now is to consolidate power and try to rebuild the country.
ISIS is still there, though, and all that chemical weaponry is, as I said, somewhere.
Well, ISIS has not advanced at all in the ensuing chaos, and in fact, both the new Syrian government and Kurdish forces have made some slight advances in areas they control. Mostly, ISIS is no longer has a territorial control as they did for a number of years there. They're mostly, terrorist cells that are scattered in various places. So it's certainly something to be concerned about. But again, having them get a hold of a mass stockpile of chemical weapons or other vital strategic centers, I think is unlikely at this point.
You mentioned the Kurds, and certainly the winner in all of this is Turkey to a great degree. The loser, I think, if you want to look at things that way, is Iran. Turkey has made the Kurds their enemy, and to a great extent, the Kurds are American allies, and the Kurds are feeling as if maybe they're going to be pressured now in different ways that they hadn't experienced before, although under Assad, things were pretty bad generally for the Kurds. So what do you foresee there?
This is a concern. I mean, the Rojava communities, which have been organized by the leading a Kurdish group there, are actually one of the few spots of a degree of democracy, of a degree of a governing body having a social base and popular support. They're pretty progressive in terms of the rights of women and accountability of their leadership. But they all also have close ties to the PKK, the Kurdish rebel group in Turkey, which has engaged in terrorism themselves in the past, and Turkey's sworn enemy. And with the Turkish-backed forces, both Syrian and some Turkish troops themselves in the far north, they seem to be taking advantage of this to advance over their control. They have relations with with HTS, the Hayam Tahrir al-Sham, the governing what's now the governing body in Damascus. They aren't that close. Turkish fighters and Turkish-backed fighters didn't really do much south of Aleppo. But their eyes are pretty much on the Kurdish areas, which is up in the northern border regions. And that is certainly an area where I think many of us observers probably have the biggest concern right now.
Well, Turkey would also like to see to it that many of these Syrian refugees go back to Syria. And how successful is it likely that they're going to be finding that viable? And particularly, are they going to stop the flow of migration into Turkey?
Well, there's certainly been a return of many refugees, particularly from Lebanon, but also from across the Turkish border. And I think the Turks may use the change of government as an excuse to push refugees out. Even in Europe, they've taken a shift that they say they're no longer going to be in a number of countries, that they will no longer be accepting Syrian refugees because of the oppression from the regime is no longer a factor, and it does not appear that ISIS is taking advantage of the situation too much. So this is obviously controversial because things are very much still in flux in a lot of ways. But whenever it happens, and however many come back, and whatever the attitudes are, the Turkish government or other governments, it's going to be a huge process. I mean, literally half of the country, we're talking about 11 million people, have been displaced, either as refugees or internal displacement. And many of them are going back to their neighborhoods that have been reduced to rubble. And this is a country, of course, that has been under strict economic sanctions for quite a few years. So there's a huge humanitarian issue here, and it's going to really be a test of the new government, whoever's in charge, to try to make the resettlement happen and enable as many refugees who want to come home, or other displaced people who want to come home, to be able to settle and try to rebuild their lives.
Well, there's so many tests for this new government, and you sound a bit hopeful and sanguine, which is nice to hear, and certainly a change over. But let me play devil's advocate here. Maybe not even devil's advocate, just let me put things in perspective in terms of democracy. And they're talking about building a constitution and an infrastructure and so on. Democracies have not exactly thrived very well in the Arab world, and particularly after the Arab Spring with hopes in Tunisia and even other countries. It's been almost universally a sense of democracies not being viable or not happening. The other thing that's of concern is, of course, these deep, profound enmities that exist in Syria, particularly after all the civil war and after the Alawite domination. In fact, there are sections now where Alawites who were once in control are fighting, and there's a lot of discord and violence going on, and there's violence with Christians, recently burning of Christmas trees and so forth. In other words, those are very deep, those kind of divisions. Healing and finding justice, particularly when each side sees its own side as being on the side of justice, kind of make one feel pretty pessimistic.
Well, it's going to be a tough road in any case. I mean, the Assad regime was nominally secular. But he did obviously favor those in the Alawite community, which is where the Assad family identifies with.
And forgive me, Stephen, it was also undeniably and incontrovertibly brutal.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Oh, my God. And here's the thing, Michael, that, virtually every Syrian I know who tend to be, secular, liberal, even leftist, they obviously are concerned about HTS and their hardcore Salafist origins and that kind of thing, but they are universally relieved and celebrating that Assad has been overthrown. And I think this is the thing we really can't emphasize enough. If we're looking at at least 500,000 dead, much of the country's infrastructure physically destroyed, half the population displaced. Tens of thousands of people tortured, as many as 100,000 disappeared, who are likely tortured to death in these prisons, the country torn apart. I mean, many Syrians think, really, what could be worse? And they, so I mean, I think that I'm again not optimistic about democracy per se, but I do think that they are going to be able to try to patch together something that is that will give some semblance of normalcy. And at least the rate of killing will indeed decline. And here's the thing, though, that the polls show that the vast majority of Arabs, especially those of a younger generation, want democracy, and they believe democracy is possible. When a country's been that devastated, it can go two directions, actually. On the one hand, you could say that, we're in a desperate situation. It requires strong leadership, tough leadership, authoritarian leadership to straighten things out. On the other hand, they could be thinking, hey, if we can't rebuild the country if we're doing it on our own narrow ideological or religious agenda. We're going to need the help of everybody. We're going to need to get the experts, the technocrats, the scientists, the health professionals, all the other people who are in exile, back here in the country to help rebuild it together. So it could go in either direction, and I really have a hard time, predicting.
Well, at this point, maybe we don't need to predict. We just have to nervously watch and observe and hope. But at the same time, you have been very critical of Israel's role. I mean, traditionally, in fact, I think it's transgenerational in your case. Your father was an Episcopal minister, and your family was pretty strong in its criticism of Israel. And there are still those who go back to the Golda Meir words of, if the Israelis laid down their arms, there would be genocide and destruction of Israel. If the Palestinians laid down their arms, there would be peace. I don't think you would probably agree with that, but you've been certainly working on conflict resolution. How can there be conflict resolution with respect to Israel? Everybody's saying, well, if we have a second Palestinian state, if we have an independent second state, that would be the answer. But there's so much distrust again, and enmity and hatred and insecurity on both sides.
Well, the fundamental thing is that the Palestinian rights and Israeli security are not mutually exclusive. They are mutually dependent upon each other. And Netanyahu, when he ruled out a Palestinian state and has said that all belongs to Israel, and said that we can ignore the Palestinians, the horrific terrorist attacks of a little over a year ago were essentially Hamas's response: "No, you can't ignore us." And that the Palestine Authority, Fatah, have agreed to a viable two-state solution along the 1967 borders that has been rejected by Israel. And the trouble is that Israel, like any country, has a right to go after extremists, terrorists, those who threaten them. But just punishing the extremists doesn't work. You also have to help the moderates. Or reward the moderates, to show people that moderation can lead to its reward. In my own view, is that there's not going to be any peace until Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have equal rights, either in a viable two-state solution or in a single binational state with guaranteed rights for both. What we've been seeing really interesting regarding to Syria, though, is a lot of people forget that there's a part of southwestern Syria that has been under Israeli military occupation since 1967, the Golan Heights. In 1981, the Israelis annexed it, which led to the United Nations Security Council unanimously, even with the support of the Reagan administration, which was very strongly pro-Israel, to declare it null and void. I mean, holding on a strategic piece of land as a security measure temporarily is legitimate under international law, but annexing it to your country is a clear violation of the UN Charter. Indeed, that's what the Ukraine war is about, that, as Biden put it, no country can unilaterally change international borders, no country can expand its territory by force. Trump ended up recognizing Israel's annexation of the territory. We've remained the only country in the world that has done so. Biden has reiterated that, which has led to charges, of course, of double standards. But the irony is that even the Assad regime had agreed to make peace with Israel, that in return for getting the Golan back, they would make peace with Israel. Full recognition, full security guarantees, demilitarized zone in the Golan, full economic relations. And they twice came very, very close to reaching an agreement. I mean, in 1999 talks under the senior Assad, it was literally a matter of a few hundred meters where the boundary would be before things broke off. But then the right-wing Likud came into power, and they put that off. And for 2007, the younger Assad, Bashir Assad, reached out to try to revive the peace agreement, and Condoleezza Rice told the Israelis, don't even think about it, because at that point we were afraid that it would strengthen the Syrian regime, therefore strengthen Iran. And Shimon Peres, the former Israeli prime minister and foreign minister, who was then serving as the Israeli president, admitted that it was the Bush administration's pressure that led the divided cabinet to reject Assad's peace overture. Now, the new government, obviously coming out of a very hardline Salafist tradition, is obviously not pro-Israel by any means, but at the same time, perhaps the pragmatism that they have shown so far domestically could also be reflected in their international affairs. But this has been complicated, of course, that Israel has violated the 1974 disengagement agreement that Henry Kissinger negotiated, and has advanced beyond the Golan to seize large areas of Syrian territory, including the strategic Mount Hermon, the largest mountain in the area.
And they're moving in more into the Golan Heights as well.
That's what I'm referring to, going beyond the Golan Heights. And Netanyahu has announced the doubling of the settler population in the Golan. And of course, transferring your civilian population onto territories seized by military force is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. But the problem is Israel's kind of been able to get away with its policy in Golan just because Assad was such a criminal, terrible dictator and the like. But still, they are these important international legal questions, and concern that the appearance is that the Syrians finally throw off Assad, and they're getting punished by it by losing even more land and losing even more strategic assets. It also challenges the silly notion that some people are saying that Israel was behind the downfall of Assad, that Israel was actually helping the Islamist rebels, because in reality, the Israelis actually preferred a defanged Assad to any of the rebel groups that might replace.
That's what the Ayatollah Khamenei is saying, that Israel and the United States were behind essentially this political victory, and that we're hearing also that the UK and the US was behind it from other sources.
Well, that's nonsense. As you know, Michael, that I have made much of my career critiquing U.S. military intervention around the world. My doctoral dissertation at Cornell was about the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran and of Arbenz in Guatemala. I've certainly been quite critical of U.S. policy in the region. I've also, of course, been quite critical of Israeli policy. But this is I can say quite firmly that neither the United States nor Israel had any significant role whatever. Assad lost because he did not have the political support, not because of any outside forces, whether they be Israel, United States, Britain, Turkey, or whatever, played a major role. I mean, this is about agency. I mean, it's the same kind of thing we heard during the Cold War, that every leftist movement was supposedly a plot from Moscow, or more recently, that popular pro-democracy uprisings in Serbia, Ukraine, or Iran, or wherever, are somehow a Washington conspiracy. Yes,
but you're not on the far left side that says Israel, river to the sea, and Israel should be extinguished and destroyed because it's a colonial apartheid power, all these kinds of things that we're hearing now. You're not on board there?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing that, I mean, there are, the thing about Zionism is that some people say, Zionism is a legitimate national liberation movement of a historically oppressed people, just like any national liberation struggles of that era. Others are saying that Zionism is a colonial settler enterprise because it brought in people from Europe, displaced the indigenous population. The fact is, Zionism has both of those elements, and it's wrong to say it's only one and only the other. And a lot of nations have been founded on great misdeeds to the indigenous populations, not the least of which is our own. And it's important to acknowledge that, but it's also you can't pretend that everybody's going to go back to Europe or go back to whatever generations later. But again, I think I think most people, frankly, that do use the term "river to the sea" are talking about a single binational state with equal rights for all. That's what the surveys of the student activists say. That slogan actually originated by leftist Palestinian nationalist group. It was only appropriated by Hamas in 2017. Obviously, their vision of "river to the sea" is, I would speculate, genocidal. But
it's in their charter, in fact.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, there's no question what Hamas means by it. But I did want to emphasize that that most people, at least that among the student activists, and again the origins of the term, are that more of a democratic secular state or some kind of binational state with equal rights for both peoples. Now, one can argue whether that's realistic or not, or how that's going to go about, but I don't think we should assume that everyone who says "river to the sea" is talking about the killing or expulsion of Israeli Jews.
I was a little surprised, though, when I read something that you wrote about the comparison between Russia going into Ukraine and violating their sovereignty, and Israel going into Syria and violating Syrian sovereignty. And what surprised me was you thought that maybe there was more criticism of Russia because it's Caucasian, and now we're not talking about darker people. We're talking about Palestinians and Jews. We're talking about Semitic people. They're both Semites.
Oh yeah, very very much so. I mean, the founders of Zionism were European Jews, but the population of Israel right now is nearly half people of North African, Middle Eastern ancestry. I mentioned the racism part, not that it's the main thing, or certainly not the only thing, but I feel strongly that there would be a more criticism of Israeli policies if their victims were white Christians. I really do. And
actually, the white Christians are more behind Israel than just about anybody, at least.
Yeah, exactly. But there are a lot of factors that lead towards the bias for Israel. Some of them are quite valid. Wanting the Jewish people to have a safe and secure, homeland, respecting their democratic institutions, at least for the Jewish citizens, that are quite strong overall. But there are other factors, including strategic issues of Israel as our unsinkable aircraft carrier, or Israel as an asset for the United States in the region. There are certainly Christian fundamentalists who see this as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. But there are also, I think, more negative aspects, including anti-Arab racism that seems to believe that the rights of Palestinians, for peace and security, national homeland, or whatever, are secondary to that of the Israelis.
Got some good questions coming in. I want to go to them. I've a lot more I'd like to address with you, but here's Rick from Pittsburgh who says, while Palestinians have had various levels of autonomy in the past, when was the last time Palestine was truly a sovereign nation, and why does it matter?
Well, most countries you see on the map today were never sovereign territories in pre-colonial times. But, they are, the fact is that the Palestinians do identify as a nation, as a nationality. And one can debate about the legitimacy of Zionism or not, or whether Israel should have been created. But the fact is that Israel was created. There have been generations of people who live there, who consider themselves Israelis, who have their national language, their culture. And you can't pretend they don't exist just because you question the legitimacy of the origins of the nationalist movement that brought them there. And similarly, one can debate about whether Palestinianism or whatever is a legitimate national identity, but the fact that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians do identify as such, and you can't pretend that neither exists.
Here's Cynthia from South Bend, Indiana, who says, with the collapse of Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah, what is Iran's influence in the region today, and what is its future? Well, we're seeing Iran at least trying to still continue influence, particularly from Yemen, because now Hezbollah has pretty much been disabled in many ways, and Hamas is under some serious Israeli destruction, to put it mildly, after Hamas led that invasion into Israel, and still holding people hostage. But it's an interesting question. Iran, as I said, has been the big loser in all this. They're trying to use Yemen now as their surrogate to some degree, and Israel's going after Yemen.
Well, it's been very much of a setback for Iran. And their ties with the Houthis have grown over the years. Even the Houthis do have their own distinct grievances and origins and things like that. They're not simply a proxy, but they are certainly an ally. And the Iranians, they, despite their claiming to be in the bulwark against imperialism or the leader of the axis of resistance, they themselves have been an imperialist power in the region, in trying to push their agenda and their influence. They have been, in my view, a decidedly reactionary influence, and it is, it's certainly a positive thing in my view that they have been set back, to some degree, by the dramatic shift in Syria. But again, I would emphasize that the overwhelming majority of people who were struggling in Syria don't care about geopolitics. They were just struggling for their freedom. They were just struggling to get rid of the Assad regime. And they generally were resentful. They're certainly resentful for the Iranian role in putting up Assad. I don't think he would have survived nearly as long as he had without the support of Iran and other outside forces.
So forgive me, Stephen, there's still this Sunni-Shia divide. I mean, and still, as I said, a great deal of adversarial sense of those two forces locking heads, as it were. I mean, one has to figure that into the future of Syria, doesn't one?
Yeah, to some degree, but the Sunni population is quite small, maybe only 3% of the population. The Alawites, which are somewhat similar to the Shias, or another 10%.
They've always been allied with the Shia, though.
Oh, yes. But my impression in the Middle East, and being in countries where there are mixtures of Sunnis and Shias, is that the biggest divide is not between Sunnis versus Shias per se, but between sectarians and nationalists in both camps. In many areas of the Middle East, if there's a village with only one mosque, Sunnis and Shias worship together. Intermarriage is not uncommon at all in many of the cities. The differences theologically between the Sunni and Shia tradition are actually less than those between Catholicism and Protestantism. This division, this is not about, when the sectarian fighting in Iraq was at its height, I'd keep getting these calls from the media saying, kind of explain about the Shia Sunni division, the battles and back in the 8th century and da. And that's like, talking about Northern Ireland and talking about the Martin Luther and the Calvin and the split from the Catholic Church. It's not really a theological thing as much as it is the way that certain manipulative political leaders and outside powers have tried to push this kind of divide and rule. And that the more and more people in the region, particularly younger people, are really tired of those kind of divisions. They see it as a manipulative thing. They believe they have more important things to worry about and struggle about than one's religious identity. Unfortunately, a lot of the more sectarian groups have the guns, but I don't share your pessimism that this is an inherent divide that's going to inevitably lead to years of conflict in Syria or elsewhere.
Well, Iran, Shia theocracy was pretty much behind Hamas and Hezbollah.
The Iranians essentially have these proxy militia, which are directly taking orders, from elements of the Iranian regime in Iraq and Syria, or until recently in Syria. They're very close to Hezbollah. Has played a major role in their development over the years. Somewhat less so with Houthis, but they're an important ally. Hamas, that connection's been grossly exaggerated. They had got some funding and some light, smaller rockets and that kind of thing, but nothing close to the support that.
I wasn't talking about military support, but their proxies were working on behalf, essentially, of that.
No. Hamas was doing the crazy stuff they were doing because of their own agenda, not because Iran, put them up to it. Indeed, Hamas and Iran were on opposite sides during the Civil War. Hamas was openly supporting the Sunni Islamist groups that were fighting Assad.
Yes, I recall that, and you're correct.
It's an alliance of convenience. I would not see it as proxies. I think that would be an overstatement. Iran, of course, has tried to take advantage of the popular outrage of what Israel has been doing in Gaza, trying to say, look, the West is supporting this genocide. The Arab governments are not doing anything. We and our allies, the one people who are actually taking a stand, are actually, challenging, Israel, through the Houthi rockets in the Red Sea, or occasionally to Israel itself and Hezbollah and the like. So this is very, very opportunistic thing. It's very similar to back in the old days when the Arab governments would, do all these, bellicose kind of statements and try to take political advantage of hostility towards Israel, when in terms of actually helping the Palestinian cause at all, they really didn't do much.
Well, we may not see things the same way on this score, but I was also surprised that you said that you didn't see where the Palestinian movement was really fomenting or working toward anti-Semitism. Or anti-Semitism is kind of a misnomer in my mind anyway, because, like I said, Palestinians are Semites also. But being anti-Jewish, there was an incident here in San Francisco with a Hillel house, for example. It was put graffiti on it that brought back the old, some of the ancient stuff.
Anti-Semitism is a serious problem, and it's been growing. And we see it in the United States, we see it in the Middle East, we see it in Europe. The rise in anti-Semitism is not Israel's actions in Gaza are not the reason for the rise in anti-Semitism. They're the excuse. Anti-Semitism, like racism or anything, is a sickness of the mind. Anti-Semitism is not the fault of Jews any more than racism is the fault of people of color. So I'm not sure what you read, but I do not downplay the very real and very disturbing rise of anti-Semitism that we've been seeing for years now, but particularly over the past 17 months. What I try to emphasize, however, is that many of the charges of anti-Semitism have been disingenuous, that they have taken slogans like "River to the Sea," which I've argued in most cases talks in terms of a democratic secular state, or intifada, which simply means shaking off. The vast majority of intifadas over the decades have been nonviolent forms of resistance. So only the second,
or jihad,
or jihad, which again it means struggle. It does not necessarily connote war. That I don't use those phrases myself just because they are triggering to many Jews and their allies, but and I discourage people from using those terms, but they don't. That's not necessarily what they mean. My concern though is that the charge of anti-Semitism has been being used increasingly in an almost McCarthyistic way of trying to stifle even legitimate criticisms of Israeli policies and U.S. support for Israel, and I think that is totally unfair. In fact, not only is it wrong for legitimate peace and human rights activists who are not anti-Jewish or not even anti-Zionist necessarily, but just think the United States shouldn't be supporting far-right governments engaging in massive war crimes, and the same kind of debates we had during the Reagan era in Central America, for example.
One of the argument, and you've heard this probably ad nauseum, that Israel is the only democracy. Right now it's under a pretty much strong right-wing regime. Maybe one could argue easily an extreme right-wing regime under Netanyahu and his political coalition, but it's the only democracy in any sense in the Middle East.
Yeah, but you'd say that South Africa was a democracy for white people. In terms of having elections and some political debate and
as you said, Israel is no longer a white nation. It's largely
yeah. But what I'm saying in terms of in this case being Jewish. People who are Jewish having more rights than others. Even within Israel, there are over 100 laws distinguishing between Jews and non-Jews. And in the occupied territory, there really is an apartheid-type situation where there are Jewish-only roads, Jewish-only communities. The Palestinians have to have special passes to travel. It is, and if you look at the areas Israel actually has control over, and that includes the enclaves that the Palestine Authority govern, because Israel can intervene any time, and they're surrounded by checkpoints and that kind of thing. That Israel is not a democracy, because when the majority of the people under the control of a government do not have a right politically to determine their future. And
I'll give a plug for Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, which goes into detail about this, when he visited, a very short visit, but to the West Bank, and experienced just what you're talking about. Another question, though. This is from Francis, and thank you for the questions, those of you who are sending them in. This is from Belmont, California. She's bringing up Saudi Arabia again. She says, Saudi Arabia seems to be working hard to rebrand themselves. What is behind this, and how successful do you think this will be? Rebranding themselves despite the killing of Khashoggi, I might say with some cynicism and skepticism or whatever, but they were, in many people's minds, part of the reason why maybe Hamas led that attack on October 7th, because they were moving more toward some kind of accord with Israel.
I doubt they would have gone all the way to full recognition without moving more forward in terms of Palestinian rights. But again, I don't think Hamas was necessarily calculating on the broader international scope, and more out of just the sheer anger and frustration and bitterness of being under siege for almost 20 years, and the failure for any real movement. I think, though, that there are two things we can talk about. I think one is that the Arab world, ever since the year 2002, in the Beirut Declaration, which was originally the Fawd Plan, named after the Saudi king, that all Arab states are on record now saying they will recognize Israel's existence, full diplomatic relations, non-aggression pact, all that kind of stuff, in return for withdrawal from the occupied territories. And Israel's rejected that. Now, what the Abraham Accords did, that were pushed by President Trump and supported by President Biden as well, is saying, well, they're essentially saying, well, let's deny any leverage to the Palestinians to end the occupation. Let's get these Arab governments to recognize Israel unilaterally, and essentially try to bribe them to do so. I mean, in the case of Bahrain and UAE, Trump conditioned it to these lucrative arms sales. Now, Bahrain and UAE are these tiny sheikdoms that have never been at war with Israel. I mean, it's not really a peace agreement when you've never been at war and never threatened war. Morocco was over 1,200 miles from Israel. Again, not a threat. But they got Morocco to recognize it in term for the U.S. becoming the first and only country to recognize Morocco's illegal annexation of the nation of Western Sahara, a full member state of the African Union, which Morocco invaded in 1975. That's the other occupation people don't talk about, which I wish we would talk about more because it has a lot of the same issues the Palestinians do. In terms of Saudi Arabia itself, it is trying to legitimize itself more and more in face of the misogyny and in face of the murder of dissidents, and indeed their terror bombing of Yemen was horrific as well. As in Gaza, we're talking about tens of thousands of civilians killed in a U.S. backed military operation. Can
you compare, in fact, from just a moment, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which has been described as perhaps the worst in the world, to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, or for that matter, the humanitarian crisis in Sudan? I mean, they're all just titanic, really.
Yes, I mean, it's staggering. I think we hear more about Gaza in part because of the is in a crowded urban area, so the horrific scenes are captured on video, and the United States has been less quiet about their support for Israel as they were with Saudi Arabia, but it is certainly not the only war of arguably genocidal proportions that is going on or has happened in the case of Yemen in recent years.
Tom has a question. Thank you, Tom, for this. He's in Columbia, South Carolina. Why didn't Egypt open their border to Gaza? Is it at all related to Jordan's experience with Palestinian refugees?
I mean, obviously, a country, especially a poor country that's struggling to feed its own people, is reluctant to allow for a mass exodus of 2 million people into what's largely a desert area with very little infrastructure. But I think also was the concern that this would be a repeat of the Nakba, or the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, which took place at the time of Israel's creation. And given there are far-right elements within the Israeli government that have quite openly talked about recolonizing Gaza and the like, there was concern that allowing that, despite the compelling humanitarian reasons, would end up in a permanent exile. I mean, obviously, I wish Egypt had been able to do that, but they unfortunately decided against it.
Well, there's a number of other questions. I hope I have time to get to them, but the big one looming in my mind is, since you've been so involved for many years in conflict resolution, trying to bring peace to areas that have, what keeps your hopes up? What makes you sanguine? And particularly, what can work that hasn't worked? Is there anything that hasn't been tried enough?
Well, I think, I've long been one of those who've argued that the United States has to apply a little bit of tough love towards Israel, unconditional support for its right to exist in peace and security, but being willing to condition military aid to its willingness to stop the attacks on civilian population centers and the starvation and other humanitarian issues that are resulting, and to be willing to share the land. And I think there's been a huge shift in public opinion in the United States, especially among younger people. In fact, I know of no issue, even LGBTQ issues, where political opinion and age is such a straight line when it comes to Israel and Palestine. People of our generation.
Pretty ironic to me that LGBTQ people are supporting Hamas, who want to kill gay and lesbian people.
Right.
I don't quite.
Well,
that doesn't quite equate or figure.
Yeah, no.
somehow.
But I think again, I'd say the vast majority of people who are out protesting out there, straight or gay, are not pro-Hamas. They are anti-war and anti-killing of civilians. I mean, remember from the solidarity movements around Vietnam and Central America and others, you'd have really some hardline elements who didn't just oppose the U.S. supporting death squads. They were supporting the communist guerrillas quite openly. And similarly, in here, that you will have, in a protest against the war and U.S. support for Netanyahu, that there'll be some of these hardline elements as well. And frankly, I think it's one thing to over-romanticize a Marxist-Leninist liberation movement, but to defend an anti-Semitic reactionary extremist group like Hamas is even worse, in my view. But I do want to emphasize that they are the minority, the very small minority of those of us who have participated in demonstrations and have raised concerns about Israel's policies and what they and the human rights and legal and moral issues involved there. But in terms of your bigger question, what I do notice is that I think we will see a shift in the policy where the United States will be much more in line with the international community. Remember, we've vetoed otherwise unanimous Security Council resolutions. We've been among less than 10 governments, the 193-member UN General Assembly, to vote against very modest kinds of resolutions, the others being either far-right governments, like Hungary or Argentina, or dependent Pacific Island states. But I think we're going to see a shift, just as we saw a shift. It finally got us out of Vietnam, finally got us out of Central America, allowed for freedom for East Timor, finally provided sanctions against apartheid South Africa, finally curbed the nuclear arms race. That popular movements can indeed influence U.S. policy, because Israel will keep doing what it's doing in terms of colonizing and oppressing and bombing, as long as the U.S. continues to support it. And the U.S. government will continue to support it only when the American people will say, hey, defending Israel is fine, but defending occupation and defending war crimes of epic proportions is not right. It's not morally right. It's not legal. It's not consistent with our values. And ultimately, does not help Israel.
The Israelis and the United States are the bad guys, and the other side, or what is perceived as the other side, are all virtuous and good in this?
Hardly. I just told.
I mean, notwithstanding Hamas, notwithstanding.
Like Palestine Authority, for example, they're corrupt as all get out, and they are.
And yet there are some who want to put them in charge of Gaza.
But they have agreed to a two-state solution. They've agreed to accept only 22% of historic Palestine alongside Israel. I mean, they are actually the relative moderates in the equation. And of course, most Palestinians don't like Fatah, which runs the Palestine Authority, or Hamas. They'd like more democracy. They like more accountability. But first and foremost, they want to end the occupation.
Aren't there more Palestinians in the West Bank who are behind Hamas, though? There are polls that seem to reveal that, I thought.
Well, not really. They've never been a majority. Even the election they supposedly won, they only got a 44% plurality. And then they seized the Gaza Strip by force when they weren't getting enough, didn't feel like they were getting enough share of the power. But there was some initial enthusiasm about, tragically and horrifically, in my view, about the terrorist attacks, because at least somebody was doing something in the eyes of some Palestinians. But most people do not support Hamas, including in Gaza. They brutally crushed the teachers' union. They've crushed other kind of dissent. This has been going on for a while. And again, most Palestinians, including a fairly sizable Christian minority, do not like their hardcore Islamist orientation either. I think a lot of Palestinians are giving up on a two-state solution, in large part because Israeli colonization of the West Bank is so thorough. It's just chopped it up into little pieces, and it's hard to imagine where the boundaries of a contiguous Palestinian state might be. So more and more are talking about a single binational state or whatever. But that doesn't mean the physical destruction of Israel. Certainly there are Palestinians that still advocate that. But saying you want a single state from the river to the sea, you don't think Israel should exist as a Jewish state, does not necessarily mean that you want to kill Jews, you want to expel Jews. Obviously, any kind of a settlement, whether it be a two-state or one-state solution, needs fundamentally to recognize that Israel is a Jewish homeland that Jews should be able to go to from wherever and over the world if there's ever risk of persecution, that it's a survival as a sanctuary for the Jewish people must be guaranteed. At the same time, that same basic right needs to be applied to the Palestinians as well.
I'm just afraid that you have too many on both sides who would like to see the extinction of many. I mean, Palestinians would like to see many Jews exterminated. Jews would like to see many Palestinians exterminated. And
but we've seen Northern Ireland and other cases that were terribly polarized and seemingly hopeless conflicts.
I still have hope when I think of Northern Ireland, and when I think, for that matter, of South Africa, because I never thought that Nelson Mandela would arise to be the leader of South Africa in an apartheid state. And for that matter, I still have hope when I think of glasnost and perestroika. However, I also think of, and let me just ask a couple of final questions here, one from a listener and one from my own, and that is, how do you think this is all affecting Putin? I mean, like I said, this is a big loss for Russia. And is it going to affect the war in Ukraine? Russia's role in the Middle East, their role in Syria, everything has been seriously diminished to a great degree.
Well, certainly it's been a setback for Putin in terms of his goals to try to reassert the influence that Moscow had in the region during the Soviet era. But quite frankly, I think he's focused much more on closer issues, including the ongoing war in Ukraine, the international isolation, the sanctions. He's desperately trying to hold things together there. So while obviously disappointed in the loss of their influence in Syria, it's probably not the biggest concern on his mind right now.
Well, you said you didn't want to necessarily make any predictions, but here's Raymond from Austin, Texas. Thank you for the question. Raymond says, how do you think Syria will be governed a year from now? You want to go out on a limb here and speculate?
I'll go on a limb. I could see that there will be some kind of interim government that is dominated by HTS, but will include representatives from other factions and other communities, and that there will be some scattered areas of continued fighting, particularly in the Kurdish regions and the like. But they will try to get some kind of legitimacy. They may not succeed in terms of the West, but could probably get support from some of the Arab Gulf states, and perhaps some funding to help start rebuilding. And there will be obviously human rights concerns and other issues. But that it's still, compared to what the Syrians have suffered through during these past 13 years. It's going to be seen, I think, in many ways as a respite, as certainly a better situation, despite all the problems and that they've had to suffer under since 2011.
I'll make this a final question, actually, since we're doing a little prognosticating here. This is from Reed, one of our regular listeners and valued member. How long before a Jewish American citizen can visit Damascus?
That's a hard one, and it's a beautiful city. I actually visited with a rabbi and people in the dwindling Jewish community there in the 1990s during my last visit. And unfortunately, I don't think it'll come until he may be more open to non-Israeli Jews at some point, but I don't think there'll be Israelis. Certainly, don't think will be able to visit until until the Golan is returned. And there's a broader peace going forward. But Syria, despite the horrific history in terms of their governance, is one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been to. It really is, and everything, to the art, the architecture, the culture, the food, the people, the natural beauty. And it's so tragic to see what the Assad family has done over the years, and then the war. And so, again, I share the concern and worry about what the new government's going to be like and where things are going to go. But given how bad things have been, I think they can. That I share the relief that so many Syrians do, that the Assad regime is gone, and they're, for better or worse, they're going to try to rebuild.
Hope deferred makes a heart sick, but when it comes, it is a tree of life. I'm going to end with that little biblical note. I want to, first of all, thank all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. You can hear us on Apple and Spotify, or go to our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, again, I invite you to join simply by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. I want to thank our Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, Tanya, and Lori. A special thanks to this week's guest, Stephen Zunes, for joining us. Stephen, pleasure.
My pleasure.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.